Wheat didn't feed civilization. It trapped it. Humans didn't choose to farm wheat. Wheat chose to be farmed by humans. And the difference between those two things is the entire story of how the modern world got built on a grain that needed us far more than we ever needed it. Start with what we think we know. The standard version goes something like this. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, clever humans in the ancient Middle East looked at wild grasses growing in the hills, figured out they could plant and harvest them on purpose, and invented agriculture. A great leap forward, the birth of civilization, humans in control, finally bending nature to their will. But here is what the bones say. Here is what the archaeological record actually shows when you look at the skeletons of the people who made that transition. They got shorter, their teeth rotted, their spines compressed under new kinds of labor. Iron deficiency appeared in populations that had never shown it before. The early farmers of the Fertile Crescent, the region spanning modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, where wheat was first domesticated around 9500 BCE, were measurably less healthy than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Less varied diet, more disease, more physical wear, harder lives by almost every biological measure we have. So the question is not, how did humans figure out farming? The real question is, why did they keep doing it once they knew what it cost them? And the answer is, wheat had them, already, before they fully understood what was happening. Here is how it worked. Wild einkorn wheat, one of the two original ancestors of every loaf of bread on Earth today, grew across the foothills of the Karakadug Mountains in what is now southeastern Turkey. It grew in dense enough patches that hunter-gatherer bands passing through could collect meaningful amounts of grain with relatively simple tools. A family group could harvest enough wild wheat in 3 weeks to feed themselves for months. That ratio matters. A short burst of effort for a long payoff. The brain reads that as a very good deal. So people came back. Every year, they came back to the same hills, the same patches, the same slopes, and slowly, without deciding to, they started staying longer near the places where the wheat grew well. They built temporary shelters that became semi-permanent. They stored grain, which meant they needed containers, which meant they needed to stay close to their stores. Storage created the logic of ownership. Ownership created the logic of defense. Defense created the logic of walls and villages and leaders who organized the walls. None of this was planned. No one sat down and said, "Let us build civilization." They just kept coming back to the wheat. And here's the twist that makes the whole story strange. The wheat was changing too. Every time humans harvested it, they were unconsciously selecting for specific traits. Wild wheat has a brittle rachis, which is the tiny stem that attaches each seed to the plant. When wild wheat is ripe, that stem snaps and the seeds scatter on the wind. That is how the plant reproduces naturally. Seeds fall, seeds spread. But the plants whose stems were slightly less brittle, the ones that held their seeds just a little longer, those were the ones humans actually harvested, because the seeds that had already scattered were gone. The ones still clinging to the stalk were the ones that made it into the basket. So without meaning to, humans were breeding a wheat that could no longer reproduce without them. A domesticated wheat plant cannot scatter its own seeds. It is biologically dependent on a human hand to harvest it, thresh it, and put some portion back in the ground. The plant traded its wild independence for something far more powerful, guaranteed, large-scale, intentional reproduction by the most capable creatures on Earth. 10,000 years ago, wild einkorn grew in one small region of the world. Today, wheat covers more than 220 million hectares across every continent except Antarctica. It is the most widely cultivated crop in human history. The plant won, spectacularly. But look at what it cost the humans, or rather, look at what they gave up without fully choosing to. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle is brutally effective in ways that get romanticized and also in ways that are simply true. Mobility is freedom from disease buildup. A band that keeps moving does not drink from the same contaminated well for 30 years. Varied diet across a huge foraging range means nutritional gaps get filled. The archaeological record from hunter-gatherer populations shows broad, strong bones, good dental health, and relatively few signs of the repetitive stress injuries that begin appearing in early agricultural skeletons. The farmers had more calories on average. They also had more famine, because now all their survival was concentrated in one crop in one place. One drought, one fungal blight, one bad harvest, and the village starves. The mobility option had already closed. You cannot easily walk away from a grain store, a mud brick house, a field you spent 2 seasons clearing. The wheat had tethered them, not with force, with the slow accumulation of investment. Each year they stayed and built and stored and planted. The cost of leaving got higher. Each generation inherited the infrastructure of the last and added more. The trap did not snap shut in a moment. It tightened one planting season at a time. And then, the social machinery that wheat required began to reshape human society from the inside. Grain can be stored, measured, and taxed. A mobile hunter-gatherer band produces nothing a chief can easily claim a portion of, but a village with a granary is a different situation entirely. Now there is surplus. Surplus creates hierarchy. Someone has to count the grain, allocate it, defend it, and decide who eats when the harvest falls short. That someone accumulates power. That power gets passed to children. And suddenly, you have the skeleton of every political system that has existed since. Writing almost certainly began as a grain accounting tool. The earliest known writing, proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk in modern Iraq, dates to around 3300 BCE, and the vast majority of the earliest inscriptions are not poetry, not law, not history. They are receipts. How many bushels came in, how many went out, who owes what to the temple storehouse. Civilization's first literature was a wheat ledger. Meanwhile, the human body was adapting, slowly and imperfectly, to a diet it had never eaten before in its evolutionary history. Amylase, the enzyme that breaks down starch, is produced in higher quantities in the saliva of modern humans than in any other primate, and geneticists have found that populations with long agricultural histories carry more copies of the gene that produces it. The genome was rewriting itself to run on wheat. Generations of people who could not digest grain-heavy diets well enough simply had fewer surviving children, quietly editing the human species toward a body that could tolerate what the trap required. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The grain reshaped the animal that farmed it at the level of DNA across hundreds of generations. In the same patient time frame, it had reshaped its own reproductive structure. Both species were changing each other. But the wheat had a simpler goal: reproduce, spread, cover the earth, and it achieved all three. By 5,000 years ago, wheat agriculture had spread from that original patch of Turkish hillside across the entire Middle East, into Egypt, across Europe, east into the Indus Valley. It did not spread because warriors forced it on unwilling populations, though sometimes that happened later. It spread the same way it always had. A surplus community grows faster than a foraging one. Growth means expansion. Expansion means new land gets cleared and planted. The wheat moved with the people it had recruited, and those people moved because the logic of agriculture, once adopted, makes expansion feel like the only rational next step. Every monument you have ever admired was built by people eating wheat. Every empire that ever raised an army fed that army on grain. Every city that ever existed past a few hundred people needed stored, transportable, taxable calories to function. Wheat did not just feed the builders of civilization, it manufactured the conditions under which civilization became possible, and then necessary, and then inescapable. The hunter-gatherer bands who once roamed freely across landscapes so abundant they only needed to work a few hours a day to eat well. Those people are almost entirely gone now. Not killed mostly. Just absorbed, recruited, tethered, slowly converted into farmers by the same mechanism that had always worked. Wheat being just rewarding enough to keep you coming back one more season. And then one more. And then one more after that. Until leaving was no longer a real option, and the life that came before was just a story the old people told. So, no. Humans did not domesticate wheat. Wheat ran the older, slower, more patient operation. It found a creature clever enough to clear land, dig channels, fight off pests, and carry seeds across continents. It made itself just useful enough that creature would never stop. And then, it remade that creature bone by bone, gene by gene, society by society, into exactly the kind of animal a grain would need to conquer the world. Wheat didn't feed civilization. It built the cage civilization lives in, and we have been calling that cage home for 10,000 years.